Welcome to Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today concludes our time with Seminar 1. In this video, I'll address the following questions. 1. What surprised me in my reading of Seminar 1? And 2. What are the top 10 ideas I encountered in going through this seminar? If you learned something from this video and want to support this work, please consider liking it, sharing it, and subscribing to my channel. One of the biggest surprises in moving through Seminar 1 is how much can be gained from slow, intentional reading. Now, in theory, I always understood this to be the case, but in practice, it's hard to implement since there's always so much to read, and sometimes, at least for me, I want to cram the content in my head as quickly as possible to have a wider base of knowledge to work from. And I think there's something good in that, especially as one is first learning about some topic or thinker. Best to try to see the forest before examining the trees, I suppose. But having done that, and now diving into the trees, I feel as though the entire forest has been transformed for me. So while it's not possible to read everything like this, I do recommend trying it out for one particular text that you're fond of. A second surprise is how much of the later Lacan is already present in the early Lacan. When beginning Lacan, many of us might resort to summaries which often focus on the latter seminars, especially 11. You may also often hear how the early Lacan was more interested in the imaginary and symbolic, whereas the later Lacan is more concerned with the real. And it's certainly true that the real takes on a more prominent role in the later seminars. But it's clearly present here in Seminar 1 as well, and in a manner that it's not simply conflated with reality. The real is what resists symbolization absolutely, Lacan says. I don't know if one could give a better definition of the real, despite later seminars elaborating upon its place among the three registers. Finally, I came to realize that I had an overly simplistic understanding of the imaginary, which I understood to be a series of identifications that give rise to the ego, and is that part of us that thinks it understands. Ironically enough, I might have been caught up in the imaginary understanding of the imaginary. What surprised me is that while none of that is incorrect, what I hadn't understood is the historical dimension of the ego. That it's formed in a series of layers that results from the seesaw of desire. And those aspects of the imaginary that are repressed come to form part of the unconscious. What I'm still confused about is how the subject is related to this repressed aspect of the imaginary, since I have also understood the subject to be unconscious and to be related to the symbolic. If the ego is that part of the subject it identifies itself as, which is at the same time a kind of misrecognition, is the subject identifying itself with the ego that is unrepressed to the repressed ego, or both but in different ways? Maybe we'll get an answer to that as we continue on with these seminars. Now I'll address my top 10 ideas for Seminar 1. This will also serve as a kind of summary of the seminar. I've ordered these not in terms of favorites, but in a manner that seems to provide some overarching coherence to the entire seminar. This will inevitably leave out many ideas. Feel free to leave comments below about what concepts or ideas were most striking to you. Number 1, the importance of time in understanding Lacan. I put this first as a foundation for understanding Lacan. If you don't have an appreciation for his approach to time, it can be very difficult to make sense of the rest. For Lacan, time is not a linear concept. What happens in the past is to be understood retroactively from the point of view of the present. Theorizing begins with the experience of the adult, and it's through the adult's point of view that we come to understand the child's experience. Similarly, the history of the subject matters only to the degree the past lives on in the present, and the past only takes on a traumatic character retroactively from the later introduction of signifiers. There's a peculiar logic to this time that doesn't conform to our more familiar sense of chronological time. Number 2, the developmental unfolding of the ego. This is something I already mentioned as what surprised me in this seminar. Lacan makes a distinction early on between primary and secondary narcissism. Primary narcissism is a dimension of the ego shared by animals. It establishes an experience of bodily unity and relation to the natural world. The organism organizes its world through a limited set of preformed frameworks or imaginary conditions that are primarily geared toward biological reproduction. However, the situation doesn't quite work out like that for the human being. This is because there is a gap created between the image of oneself as a bodily unity and the reality of one's state of bodily impotence that results from a premature birth and underdeveloped nervous system. Consequently, humans are not able to apply frameworks that allow us to neatly fit within our environments. Unable to achieve satisfaction on its own, the child seeks out others who can help with this. These others provide the child with an image of mastery in the form of an ideal ego. The child then may identify with this image and appropriate it as its own. Such identifications are not a moment in time, but an extended series. However, the other inconsistently reflects the ideal image, and that ideal image is itself a distortion as it contains within it elements of the other's desire. So we have here a few things going on. First, in identifying with the ideal ego, we also assume the desire of the other as our desire, producing a fundamental alienation in ourselves. Along with this, we also have fluctuations in how well the other fulfills this ideal ego, leading one to vacillate between love and hate. This all gives rise to the unique history of the subject, a history defined by a layering of ego identifications that serves as the basis for the fully formed ego later on. Number 3 is the introduction of the symbolic. If we remained in this state of imaginary identification and so only functioned in the affective states of love and hate, we would eventually destroy each other, or at least Lacan believes so. But this is not the end of the story, as there is always a third, a governing order that mediates the relationship between subject and other. The child receives an apprenticeship into this symbolic order through an ongoing series of approvals and disapprovals, acceptances and rejections, yeses and nos. Over time, the child learns the rules of their social situation, and in so doing, introjects a symbolic order that is connected to and founded upon the law that provides the symbolic its particular structure and rules of exchange. Upon installation of the symbolic, it becomes the only means for accessing the imaginary, as it's what structures and shapes it. The symbolic also has a life of its own, independent of the ego, and lives kind of like an interiorized foreign body. In inhabiting us, or more accurately in our inhabiting the symbolic, we're made capable of speech, which always allows us to bring things into existence, to make what is absent present. The symbolic relates to our imaginary world in one of two ways: sublimation and repression. The ego ideal is that element of the law responsible for sublimating the desire born out of our imaginary identifications. The superego, in contrast, is that element of the law responsible for repressing desire. Though coming from the law, the superego functions as an element of the law that has gone off the reservation, so to speak, becoming a misrecognition of the law. This leads to number 4, the origin of the symptom. Some elements of our imaginary identifications and associated desire are so unacceptable as to remain unintegratable by the symbolic. In this manner, these images acquire a traumatic quality after the fact and are repressed by the superego, but in such a manner as to take on a life of its own, disconnected from the rest of the symbolic order. Consequently, one is under attack on two fronts. First, there are the unsymbolized but repressed traumas that form a pathogenic nucleus. Nonetheless, though repressed, the desire for recognition persists, leading it to assume a disguised form by borrowing another signifier. We may call this the symptom. Then there is the superego that, in a sense, creates the pathogenic nucleus by forbidding recognition of the trauma. It represses in such a way that is vicious and senseless, and so is responsible for the compulsion to repeat that aims to master the original traumatic experience. Number 5, the ego is the symptom par excellence. The ego begins as a form of misrecognition as we identify with what we see in the other, as we've already discussed. At this early stage, it vacillates between love and hate. However, upon introduction of the symbolic, the ego seems to take on two distinct roles, which we've mentioned before. It continues to function as a kind of misrecognition of oneself, and in so doing, it's that part of the subject that thinks it is the whole. It considers itself the master of its speech and covers over the gaps of knowledge, seeing instead a seamless, integrated reality. Distinct but related to this is the ego's function as a symptom. There are elements of one's imaginary rendered unconscious due to the repressing effects of the superego, and as such seems to be part of what forms the pathogenic nucleus. It is what resists being spoken, and thus refuses to be recognized. I'm still not sure if the unconscious ego is the pathogenic nucleus itself, or if it's merely the principal form of defense against its recognition. Either way, it is the expression of pathology in the human being. It's also the case that the ego is kept under watch by the superego. And so there seems to be something of the symbolic that seeks to keep the ego in its place, almost reinforcing its symptomatic function, but in a punitive manner. Number 6, the recognition of desire in speech. If the traumatic pathogenic nucleus is what has yet to be integrated into the larger symbolic world, and if its activity is marked by a desire for recognition, then the central aim of psychoanalysis is to bring the truth of one's desire into being by naming it. Lacan's favorite example of this is the word elephant, which makes the elephant real for us even though no actual elephant is present. Since speech is the sole means by which one can begin to reintegrate repressed desire, it's the primary focus of psychoanalysis. Number 7, free association as the central technique. This priority upon speech helps us make sense of the role of free association in psychoanalysis. In this unnatural situation, one is, to a greater or lesser degree, freed from the conventions for conversing with the other when doing free association. Consequently, speech can move more freely, opening up the possibility of exposing the gaps of one's history through the hesitations and mistakes embedded in one's discourse with the other. This delivers a double aim for psychoanalysis. First, for the subject to commit to bringing the repressed imaginary identifications into being, and second, to do so by assimilating them into the symbolic through speech. Number 8, the mistake reveals the truth. There are different kinds of speech, however, some that are efficacious in integrating the repressed into the symbolic, and others that resist such activity. These two forms are called full speech and empty speech, respectively. Empty speech emanates from the ego and is directed at another ego. In analysis, it functions as a kind of resistance to free association and fails to reveal the truth of the unconscious. Full speech, in contrast, disrupts empty speech and expresses the truth of the subject. It reveals the unconscious through moments of failure, deformations, mistakes. What the analyst listens for are the moments of full speech within empty speech, or, put another way, to listen attentively for the speaking subject who speaks in and through the discoursing subject. Number 9, transference as symbolic exchange. When full speech emerges from empty speech, a kind of symbolic transference occurs. Transference is the crossing of these discourses as they occur within intersubjectivity. It involves an exchange of signifiers through a process of interlineation, whereby present signifiers are divested of their present meaning and repurposed for another meaning that emerges from the unconscious. The occurrence of these exchanges in speech is not limited to an individual, but always happens in discourse with the other. When transference happens, at least symbolic transference, the analysts may on occasion offer up their own signifiers, which reflect back to the analysand their own words in such a way that they can begin to appreciate the mistakes in their discourse and recognize the desire that's being spoken in those moments. Finally, number 10, ignorance as the most important passion. The disposition that facilitates all of this is the passion of ignorance, according to Lacan. This passion lies at the junction of the symbolic and real. Though it's not made clear in this seminar, we can venture a guess why this is, and perhaps it's because one is aware of the gaps in the symbolic, and those gaps are the unsymbolized elements of the real. This is what makes it a learned ignorance. One has indeed acquired a symbolic system that organizes and structures the imaginary, but in a state of learned ignorance, one recognizes that this structuration is not complete, that there are fissures or ruptures. To know that you don't know, as Socrates put it, to be in a state of ignorance is the condition of possibility for bringing something new into the symbolic. For this reason, it's the most important passion in psychoanalysis. And we could broaden this and ask, is this not the path for education more generally? When I first started reading Lacan, I began in a state of complete ignorance. Then, once I gained enough knowledge to say something about Lacan, I thought I understood what I was saying. But in pushing past the novice's arrogance, I have come to see the holes in my understanding, that there are gaps in my knowledge that I readily fill in with simplistic explanations. After reading through Seminar 1 this time, I feel I have grown in my knowledge of Lacan, but at the same time, I'm also more aware of the gaps in my knowledge. And it's for this reason that our thought must always be in motion, to never settle in our pursuit of knowledge. Thought in motion is a thought that deepens as it spirals closer and closer to the unnameable thing, hopefully allowing more and more to be recognized, while also acknowledging that it's a movement of infinite approximations, with plenty of slips and regressions along the way. And with that, we'll end today. The next video will be the first on Seminar 2. Thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.